Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lydia Moland. She is a professor of philosophy at Colby College in Waterville, Maine, in the US. She has written extensively on 19th century German philosophy, and more recently, she has also been interested in abolitionism in the US, and she wrote a book titled Lydia Maria Child, A Radical American Life, based on the American abolitionist with the same name. So, Dr. Moland, welcome to the show. It's a big pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Okay, so I would like to start by talking about your work on 19th century German philosophy. So, first of all, why did you get interested specifically in 19th century German philosophy? And do you think that, if anything, there's specific aspects of it that make it distinct from other kinds of philosophy from other places and other time periods?
Yes, thank you for that. I got interested in German 19th century philosophy through Spinoza. So I took a very general philosophy course as an undergraduate, and I had intended to be a political science major, but I read Spinoza and it just blew my mind, and I was so moved by the vision that Spinoza had of holism and of and the way he argued, that I decided to do more philosophy and ended up in a course that ended with Kant. And I think, as many people do, finished with some very deep dissatisfactions with Kant's dualism and with his rationalism. And someone said to me, well, if you are impatient with Kant, maybe you should try Hegel. So the next semester I took a course on the phenomenology of spirit, and then I was just hooked. And I ended up going to Tübingen in Germany, where Hegel himself studied. I lived there for a couple of years and really immersed myself in the culture of that particular time period. So many of your viewers will know that Tübingen is also where Hölderlin lived and studied, and also Schelling. So Hegel was there in this incredibly fertile environment where people were taking Kant very seriously. Spinoza was still essentially forbidden. He was still considered too controversial and too heretical to take seriously, but they were all closet Spinacists. And I found all of that very intriguing. I think what really pulled me into Hegel was his attempt to make philosophical sense of religion and of Protestantism in particularly. I came from a Protestant background and was really intrigued by his attempt to show what was important and vital about the Protestant worldview without attaching it to a kind of religious literalism. So that was very helpful to me, even just in thinking through my own philosophical questions. So as far as what makes that period distinct, a couple of things come to mind, again, sort of connected to Spinoza, I think. Again, this idea of holism, the attempt not to think of philosophy as just addressing one problem or focusing on just epistemology or just metaphysics, but the idea that an idea could possibly explain kind of everything. I think characterizes a lot of early 19th century philosophy in Germany, certainly not later. But sometimes when I teach students this, I find that claim is really strange to them, that there could be one answer or one idea that could explain everything. But I sometimes push back on that and say, wouldn't it be even stranger if different parts of the reality or of philosophy were totally unconnected from each other? I mean, wouldn't it be sort of strange if nature functions in a completely different way from art or from politics or from epistemology? So isn't there something even just more intellectually consistent about looking for an idea that could explain most of human experience and maybe even non-human experience? So that's one. Another, I think, a lot of really existential questions get started in the 19th century. So you see that some in Kant for sure. But I think it took this generation of thinkers who grew up in the French Revolution, which meant that everything they thought they knew about the way politics could and should work was challenged, and then there were great hopes around the French Revolution, and then they were dashed. And so this was a generation that really grew up feeling the existential weight of a major historical disappointment if you were a young person in that generation. And so a combination, I think, of Kant's turn towards the subject, which really gives an individual subject an enormous amount of power and therefore also responsibility, opens up these big existential questions. And then living in this part of history where there are enormous shifts that ask questions like, what is the role of politics and what is the role of the individual in politics? And how do individuals assert themselves in the face of great historical forces? Those set the stage for the kinds of grappling with what does it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to be alienated in a society? Obviously something that's then picked up by Marx and then more by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche later in the century. And then I would also say, and this is clearly in part because of my own work, a real reorientation around art and around aesthetic experience. So that certainly gets started in Kant with his taking seriously aesthetic experience as one of the most important things about human experience. But then when you get to people like Hegel, but also very much his contemporaries like Schlegel or Novalis, Bettina von Arnim, Carolina von Gunderode, some of these other people who saw in art and then also in nature and our aesthetic responses to nature really central truths about the human condition, then I think you get something very interesting that lasts throughout the century. In part because I think one way I try to think about it is the question, what if art, far from being derivative or entertaining or the thing that we can philosophize about, kind of if we get to it, what if instead it is the thing that can explain us to ourselves and the world to ourselves better than other branches of philosophy? If that's true, then a lot of things need to be revolved, sort of any kind of revolution. So I'll stop there, but those are a couple of the things that I find really compelling and possibly, I don't know, unique, but certainly indicative of that period in that place in the world.
Okay, so I have to tell you straight away that the three German philosophers whose work I'm most familiar with are Kant, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer. So probably because of some of my personality traits, I don't know exactly why, but those are the three I felt most compelled about. And I mean, but of course, I guess that we could pretty much say that everyone in the 19th century in German was to some extent influenced by Kant, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even the ones who rejected most of his philosophy or some or parts of his philosophy, like for example Schopenhauer and Nietzsche to a greater extent, even them were very much influenced by Kant. I think we could
Absolutely.
say. And of course, I mean, it's not that German philosophy in the 19th century is a monolith. Like, for example, sometimes people talk about German idealism, but I mean, you get into figures like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, and they were extremely different from Kant or what you would consider just general idealism. Nietzsche particularly sometimes is classified as a romantic or a rationalist, and he certainly rejected many aspects of Kant's philosophy, and Schopenhauer was very much a pessimist, for example. So, but I mean, do you think that we could look even with those differences, and of course we could talk about the other philosophers, and they certainly have many distinct things about their philosophical corpus, I think, but Do you think that even with all of those differences and existentialism also that I didn't mention and all of that, that we can still find recurrent themes in 19th century German philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, I think one really is the struggle with the nature of subjectivity and
Okay.
what it means epistemologically, metaphysically, politically, aesthetically. What does it mean to be a self? And like if you think, and not to oversimplify, but if you think about someone like Descartes just saying, well, the self is a thinking thing, it's essentially an immaterial substance, its essence is just to think, and it subsists as a thinking thing. Um, a quick contrast to Kant, I think, is Kant's idea of the self as an activity. So, as something that is actively synthesizing whatever is coming at it, and that it only achieves selfhood through being active. And I think, in a way, one of the questions that survives all the way through the century then is what kind of activity is that? And what does the basis of thinking through subjectivity mean for objectivity and for reality and for how we treat other people? And obviously, paired with that is the question of whether there is a transcendent divine that humans are beholden to or created by, and who dictates reality as we see it. And in my opinion, Hegel, for instance, is trying very hard to reorient us from that to seeing that humans are the only creators of meaning, and that we only create meaning in cooperation with each other. So if you think about Kant as primarily thinking of the subject as activity, Hegel, I think, picks that up, but with a much stronger emphasis on the kind of mutual recognition that's necessary to think about, my being a subject is dependent on your recognizing me as a subject, and only when we recognize each other not just as abstract subjects, but as subjects embodied in different roles and different areas of history, different life plans, can we really treat each other with the dignity and respect that Kant had originally said we owed each other. And so I think, like, if you follow that trajectory out and start to think about, like, Kierkegaard's grappling with what it meant to be a subject kind of at odds with the conventional world or norms that were established by a society that he didn't feel acknowledged by. And then someone like Nietzsche, who I think is even more expressly celebrating the agony and the ecstasy of being a self-creating subject. So I think in Nietzsche, much more than in Hegel, you get, again, the existential, I'll say it again, agony and ecstasy of the fact that we have to create our own meaning, where we can't rely on the divine or on nature as something separate from us to tell us what is meaningful. We have to do it ourselves, and that is a great privilege and honor, but also an enormous responsibility that I think in Nietzsche's view, more than in Hegel's, only some people are really up to shouldering. So in Nietzsche, then you get the sense that lots of people would just really rather prefer to have others tell them what is meaningful. And our calling is to resist that. I think Hegel, for instance, is much less interested in that kind of resistance and more interested in trying to think of ourselves as a cooperating group of people, each with our own subjectivities, but working out our subjectivity and our bid for freedom very much with each other, as opposed to in the kind of individualistic way that you get with Nietzsche.
Mm-hmm. That subjectivity part, I mean, what I'm going to say now, if I say something that you don't agree with or you think is incorrect, please correct me. But I mean, of course, in someone like Nietzsche and his, to some extent, perspectivist philosophy, because he particularly in Beyond Good and Evil, for example, when it comes to morality more specifically. There are places in his work where he expresses a very perspectivist perspective on things, and things seem to be very dependent on the subject and subjectivity. But I mean, don't you think that even in Kant, particularly when in the Critique of Pure Reason, he talks about, for example, the limits of how of the information we can get from our senses, those kinds of limits, and also the fact that we sort of have some sort of categories of understanding, and I think that some of them he takes from, I guess, Aristotle, if I'm not mistaken, and expands on them. I mean, and then also when he gets into the antinomies, and he talks about things that even us, through a reasoning process, cannot fully answer, like, for example, if there's life after death, if there's a God, if the universe is infinite in time and space, questions like that. I mean, isn't there, even if only a tiny seed of subjectivity planted there? Because, I mean, it seems that there's the thing in itself, or whatever reality is, and then our own limitations as human subjects when it comes to perceiving it and getting an objective understanding of what it is. I mean, I don't know, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's 100% right. And I think that's a kind of radical postulate that I don't even think Kant felt the existential weight of, which is to say, it took someone, well, I'm much more familiar with the early romantics, the Schlegel and Schelling and Novalis and Gunterode and people like that, who took that, I just feel like, much more to heart. And as you say, I think it is partly dispositional or generational that, Kant would have laid those things out fairly matter-of-factly. But I think the consequences for how we think about our role in and our responsibility in the world, and the radical perspectival nature of that, as you say, was really exhilarating and upsetting to the next generation of thinkers.
So, getting into Hegel then specifically, of course, you've already said a few things about him, but getting specifically into aesthetics, because when we think about Hegel, I mean, people who are not philosophers and not specifically very familiar with Hegel's philosophy, we tend to just think about these more systematic and abstract approaches to history and thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and stuff like that.
Yes.
But he also, in fact, wrote about aesthetics, right?
Yes, and that was part of his system for sure. So aesthetics is the first part of absolute spirit. So if you think of the system writ large, you've got subjective spirit, and well, first you have logic, and then you have philosophy of nature, and then in philosophy of spirit, you first have subjective spirit, and then objective spirit, and then absolute spirit. Absolute spirit is where Hegel talks about the three ways that he thinks humans grapple with what it means to be human. So the ways in which we reflect on the world, but also on our role in the world. So the first of those is art, and then religion, and then being a philosopher, Hegel always has philosophy win at the end. So philosophy for Hegel is still the best, most complete and most explicit way that humans reckon with their own status and ask themselves about meaning in the world. But art has a really important place in that for Hegel, because we are embodied sensual beings. And contrary to what some people think about Hegel, he doesn't regret that. I mean, it isn't that if we could, we should get rid of that part of ourselves. I think he thinks that that's a very rich and very vital way in which humans remain part of the natural world. So we continue to feel and smell and hear things that are outside of us, but we also use our senses to create things that then mean something to us and that reflect our own grappling with that meaning. So I think that for Hegel, aesthetics is the sensuous way of experiencing truth. So truth for Hegel, again, back to Spinoza, is this very holistic view of the identity and difference. So he says the true is the whole. It's the thing that brings together contraries. And this is where people get the thesis, antithesis, synthesis theme that you just referred to. And so art is the way that we can sense that truth through our senses, as opposed to understanding it through narratives, which is the way Hegel characterizes religion. So interestingly, religion for him is primarily about narrative, stories that we tell ourselves to explain everything from the origin of the world to our own relationship to each other through. And then philosophy is supposed to do that without narrative and without our senses, so just through thought. So then within aesthetics, Hegel's project is to say how art does that and which kinds of art and which particular instances of art do that best. So for him, the question always is this particular art form or this particular artwork allowing us to sense the idea, which is the unity of unity and division, or the true that is the whole. So he does this in a couple of ways. One, by giving what some people call the first really philosophical history of art. I always think people are too quick to assign first to anything, and usually when they do that, it's to a male European philosopher, and I think that is often not true, so I try to be skeptical about that. But whether he was first or not, he certainly had a very influential idea of the sort of history and progress of art. So that's in what's part 2 of his lectures on the philosophy of art. And then he has a whole part 3, and I'm happy to get into it. This is one of my major claims in my book on Hegel's aesthetics, is that part 3 has been essentially neglected by Hegel scholars. But that's where he talks about what he calls individual arts, which are architecture, sculpture, painting, music, and poetry, importantly, in that order, because that's the order in which Hegel thinks he can explain how humans increasingly come to take ownership of their own art. So I'm happy to talk about that later. But anyway, so that in general is where aesthetics and the philosophy of art fits in Hegel's system. And the other big claim that I make in my book on Hegel's aesthetics is that we learn so much about Hegel's idealism through his aesthetics. So it's not just that, okay, we get Hegel's system and then when we have time, we can do the aesthetics. But if we don't understand the aesthetics, we don't understand really crucial things about Hegel's theory of selfhood, about feeling, about perception, like things that people usually talk about under the heading of metaphysics or epistemology. But I think there's a lot to learn about those more traditional fields. Well, I shouldn't even say traditional fields, because that wasn't the case in Hegel's generation, that people thought that metaphysics and epistemology were like the core philosophical enterprises and aesthetics was just derivative, really the opposite. So it's more because of the way philosophy developed, especially in the early 20th century, that we've come to think that again. So part of what I try to do here is reorient us towards thinking about it the other way.
So there's something that you mentioned there that I would like to get more into. So, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems then that in a way, the way Hegel approaches aesthetics, I mean, it's not as some sort of a separate field or domain from all the other domains of philosophy, like epistemology, probably ethics and metaphysics, because I mean, isn't it also that as Hegel understands art and aesthetics more generally, that it ties very much to epistemology, for example, and how we understand the world and how we acquire knowledge about it?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So there are things that we can only sort of know through our senses. So that's an epistemological question. And there are ways in which our status as embodied beings can only be known to us through our senses. And so if we don't talk about art, we're not talking about a key part of epistemology. And I think that Hegel has a pretty clear sense that our senses are, again, it's not, sometimes people think that Hegel thinks that we'd be best if we were disembodied. And I just think that's absolutely false. So insofar as part of what we know is embodied, and there is such a thing as embodied knowledge, this is where we get it. We get it through aesthetics. And I should say, strangely, especially coming after Kant and Schelling, Hegel is completely uninterested in natural beauty. Like, he just doesn't even really want to talk about it. He is almost exclusively interested in the philosophy of art and in aesthetics as an artistic phenomenon. But other people have certainly talked a lot more about our aesthetic appreciation of nature. And Schiller is a great example of that. And it's always been very surprising to me that Hegel doesn't engage with that conversation in Schiller more than he does. But yes, absolutely. So, like, to give you an example, when he talks about music for Hegel is the way we sense time. And if you think about Kant's talking about time as one of the two a priori intuitions through which that is necessary to our understanding the world and having experience at all, for Hegel, music is the thing that in the most pure sense allows us to sense time. And since time is so critical to selfhood, so there's no selfhood without time, in a way, he thinks that music allows us to sense the self. I mean, it doesn't get more root epistemological and metaphysical than that. So what music allows us to do is have this very pure sense of what is so purely part of our existence, namely time. And that, Hegel thinks, is why music literally moves us. I mean, literally and metaphorically. So you can be moved by music emotionally. But Hegel himself says that sometimes without knowing it, we'll start tapping our feet or moving our body. I love that image of Hegel as like, we tend to think of him as such a serious German philosopher, and he was. But he himself recognizing that sometimes he couldn't help but move. That's really deep knowledge of ourselves. And again, the knowledge without which I think Hegel thinks our own understanding of ourselves would be impoverished.
That's all very interesting. I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating about some philosophers is that nowadays, through science, we are confirming some of their ideas or intuitions, things that they've arrived at without, I mean, not through science, at least as we understand it today, of course. But for example, when you were talking there about embodiment and embodied knowledge, I mean, nowadays we have an entire field of embodied cognition and how we acquire knowledge through not just through operations that occur in our brain, but through our brain being connected to the rest of our body, and how we move in the world and the actions we do and how we interact with things. And I mean, it's really fascinating to me. And I mean, as I said, I'm more familiar with people like Nietzsche, but even Nietzsche, we could say, was very much a philosopher of action. I mean, he loved to walk a lot and thinking while he was walking, and he talked about doing philosophy with a hammer. And, and he very much admired people of action and I mean doing things instead of just sitting and thinking, and have this sort of more Platonic vision of things that perhaps we could or should in a way try to disembody ourselves,
Yeah.
which in a way seems very I mean, there's a very interesting caricature of that. I don't know if you ever watched the movie The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, but
No.
there's a scene there played by Robin Williams where he's the king of the moon. I think it's the king of the moon, but the man on the moon, and he can separate his head from the rest of the body just to try to become more enlightened, and it doesn't
Mm,
really work. So
mm.
I think it's a very funny parody of that sort of disembodied idea of
Yeah.
rationality or epistemology. So.
Yeah, yeah. And I do think that Hegel, despite his reputation, also resisted that kind of reification of reason and of the mind. And, there's a lot of that in his philosophy of subjective spirit, too, when he talks about anthropology and psychology and ways in which our minds are very formed by what happens around us. And he talks about insanity in those passages as being very much tied to our embodied existence. So there's way more of that in Hegel than most people think. And again, I think the aesthetics are a wonderful way to get at that. I mean, I'll say one other thing about it. I think part of what Hegel really appreciated about art is that we go through our everyday lives sensing things, but not being aware that we're sensing them. So not being aware of ourselves as seeing and as hearing and as touching. And when we do that, I think Hegel thinks we risk beginning to treat the world as something that's just out there, that's a given. So McDowell and Brandom have been talking about this for a very long time. McDowell, especially the myth of the given, right? So the world is out there, and what epistemology is just our attaching our ideas to the outside world in an accurate way. And I think Hegel thinks that happens in part just out of habit, of course. So when I walk by a tree, I can't every time think, wow, I'm seeing a tree. And even though, it seems this way from this perspective, it's actually a different way from that. I'd never get through my day. But what art does is remind us of what our senses are doing by disrupting that in really interesting ways. So, and one example would be looking at a painting and realizing that I can see 3 dimensions where there aren't 3 dimensions. And that tells me something about the interaction of my mind with the world. So we might think a painting is a paradigmatic example of something that just exists independently outside of us. But actually, for it to exist as a painting, there has to be someone looking at it and perceiving it in a certain way. And Hegel thinks that kind of mutual formation between the self and the world actually is what is true of us all day, every day. But we get used to it. It becomes, and this is a really important technical term for him, prosaic, right? We start to treat it as just sort of normal and given and as existing independently of us. And what art reminds us is that, in fact, everything that we sense and everything that we do is part of our mutual engagement and formation with the world. And I think Hegel famously doesn't articulate a theory of aesthetic experience the way Kant does. So Kant says, it's the playing of the faculties, and that's part of why it gives us pleasure, is because it gives us a break from our kind of prosaic parsing of the world. Hegel doesn't ever actually say that. But I think what he implies is that when we are disrupted out of our prosaic attitude towards the world into a more aesthetic attitude towards it, we're actually sensing truth in a way that we don't otherwise. So if I go from just seeing the tree to having an aesthetic experience of the tree, that's actually a more true experience of the tree. And that's part of what gives me joy. So I think that's part of what Hegel thinks is going on in all kinds of aesthetic pleasure.
So there was a point there in my previous question where you mentioned the fact that at a certain point in his work on aesthetics, Hegel talks about how humans can take ownership of their art through specific kinds of art. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so this is behind his trajectory from architecture to sculpture to what he calls, or actually it's one of his editors, but anyway, the three romantic arts, which are painting, music, and poetry. So, and many other philosophers like Herder had put art into a different trajectory. So I think one really good way of trying to figure out what Hegel's up to is to compare those and you know, why does he put what at the top? So for Hegel, architecture is the art form that feels most externalized to humans, right? So it's big in scope. It's also usually functional, although he also talks about architecture that's not functional. And it has to do primarily with matter that seems independent of humans, so stone or brick or wood. And then sculpture also has a more an externalized material, so whether that's marble or plaster or whatever. But in sculpture, at least paradigmatic sculpture as Hegel understands it, humans start to reflect themselves in it. So paradigmatic sculpture for Hegel is ancient Greek sculpture, where humans are no longer making like monstrous, exaggerated forms, but more just straight up human forms. So that's more attention to the human and more attention to the subjective. And then when you get to painting, music, and poetry, you're increasingly focusing humans' attention on what's going on inside of them as arts material. So color doesn't, I mean, let me put it this way. It's more obvious to us that color doesn't exist in the world the way that stone exists in the world. Okay, so Hegel still doesn't think that we should talk about stone as existing independently of us. But leaving that aside, painting more obviously points out to us our involvement in whatever is painted. And so I already talked about like perspective, but that's true also of color. And Hegel likes to talk about how it's possible for a human to see a form like a human, not even by drawing, but just by juxtaposing colors against each other. So even if there isn't a human form drawn, if you juxtapose the colors, a human will see a drawing where there isn't one, right? So again, more activity on the part of the subject. And then music, as I was saying a minute ago, same thing, music is totally interior, right? So there we can't really talk about any material that's outside. Like we can talk about the instruments, but the instruments aren't the music. And they certainly aren't my experience of the music. So that's totally interior. And then poetry, so Hegel, and this is one of the interesting differences between Hegel and other philosophers, including Schopenhauer, right? So Schopenhauer puts music at the top because he wants really to highlight that kind of subjectivity. But Hegel is always interested in the unity of identity and difference, right? So he doesn't want to stop at subjectivity. He wants to go back to integrating subjectivity back into objectivity. And so when we get to poetry, we have something that's 100% human creation, namely language as material, but it's not as subjective as music, because language is something that you and I have to agree on some level. Otherwise, it wouldn't count as language. If I just start, speaking gibberish, that might be my private language, but it's not going to function like language unless I'm in dialogue, literally, not just with one person, but with a whole culture. So then when we get to, as a kind of poetry, which then embodies language as this very human creation and this very mutually formed creation back into action, right? So then you have characters, embodied characters, back to embodiment, embodied characters on a stage using language that's been mutually agreed upon, not just between individuals, but by a culture, then Hegel thinks we've got a really profound experience of collective aesthetic creation that can unite us as a community while also showcasing the kind of subjectivity that a character like Antigone or Hamlet is experiencing. So, so that's the way in which Hegel, that's why Hegel orders them the way he orders them, and decides that drama is the most complete form of aesthetic experience, which does not, and we'll probably get to this in a minute, mean that he thinks that it's the best form of art, but it is the highest aesthetic experience philosophically for humans.
You know, while you were talking, I was thinking at a certain point, because you mentioned Schopenhauer there, that if, I mean, of course, you probably already alluded to some of that in your answer, but I was wondering to what extent Hegel's aesthetics also connects to his metaphysics, because when you mentioned Schopenhauer, I mean, Schopenhauer is at least for us more modern contemporary people, it's a bit of a weird idea, but if I understand it correctly, I think that okay, so Schopenhauer took that division from Kant, the division between the noumenon and the phenomenon, and the the noumenon, sorry, supposedly is what reality itself is. I mean, the fundamental nature of reality, and this is also something I guess that Nietzsche talks about in The Origin of Tragedy, because back then in his first book he was already very much influenced by Schopenhauer. He then left some of that out of his philosophy later on, but didn't Schopenhauer have this sort of idea that music itself was part of the fundamental nature of reality?
Yeah, absolutely. And for Schopenhauer, the reason we love music so much and the reason it moves us so much is because it is the most raw experience of reality we can get. And absolutely, it moves us because it is also, you know, and this is, I think, is the kind of thing Hegel thought too, that the joy that we get in it and its immediate access to our emotions, so that music can make us sad about nothing, right? So it's not, if I listen to sad music, I'm not sad about anything. I'm just sad. That's incredible. Like the fact that that's possible, Schopenhauer thinks, says something really profound about the nature of reality and about the nature of being human. And I think Hegel's attuned to that as well. It doesn't, again, because he's more interested in thinking about a society in which people work together. I mean, Hegel, I sometimes say to my students, is just more interested in like making sure that the society functions. And so he's much more interested in saying, okay, what institutions are going to be necessary for us to create a society in which humans can live to their full potential. And someone like Schopenhauer, as I understand him, is just much less interested in that. So I think Hegel wants to pull back from this kind of reification of subjectivity and say, okay, it's really good, it's really important, it's fundamental to modern humans. Now we've got to show how it can be fostered within institutions. And so I think that's part of why music doesn't top the list for him. And to your original question about metaphysics, absolutely. I mean, this is the structure of reality as far as Hegel is concerned, the identity of identity and difference. And so the way in which the trajectory of the arts, including music's subordinate place to drama and to poetry in general, is a metaphysical commitment on Hegel's part. Absolutely.
I mean, you mentioned drama there. Did Hegel have specific views about tragedy and comedy?
Yes, this is something I've thought about a lot. And probably many of your viewers will know that Hegel is most famous for talking about tragedy. So his interpretation of Antigone has been, in particular, very influential. And I mean, the thousands of pages that have been written on that are testament to how how important and revelatory his theory of tragedy was. But much less attention has been paid to his theory of comedy. And so I got really interested in that at a certain point, both what Hegel says about comedy and why it has been not taken as seriously. Really quick answer to the second question, that's just really typical that philosophers tend to take serious things more seriously. And unless you want to take comedy seriously and therefore risk being comic yourself, because how ridiculous is it to take comedy seriously, people don't do it. I have spent probably more time in my life than I should taking comedy very seriously. I teach a course on it. And that is in part because I got interested in what Hegel says about tragedy and comedy. So in short, and I'm much more focused on what he says about it in his lectures on aesthetics rather than what he says in the phenomenology, but I do think they are connected. Tragedy for Hegel shows a kind of subjectivity very entrenched in itself and in roles in particular, in like social roles. So if you think about Antigone, she is struggling with her role as a daughter and as a sister and as a subject, right? So her brothers have been killed. She wants to bury one of them. She feels that that's her duty. Her uncle, the king, is also her king now, and she's supposed to obey him, and he forbids this since one of her brothers was a traitor. So the tragedy there is between two people who are deeply invested in their subjective relationships to their roles, and those roles are incompatible. So there's no way for it to end without one of them dying. Or it's not several people die, but of the two of them, only one of them dies. And so but insofar as Hegel is always interested in the unity of unity and division, what you get there is two people whose conflict with each other cancels itself out. And then what you get at the end, the synthesis, although Hegel doesn't use that word, is the survival of the Greek city-state with increased knowledge of how those roles have to be treated within the polis. So Creon ends the play essentially admitting that he shouldn't have had the attitude that he had to his role. So for Hegel, the reason that tragedy is art is because it shows this clash, which ends in a kind of unification. Yeah. Comedy also, ancient comedy, and Hegel's favorite is Aristophanes, also ends in reunification. But it's because, like, if you take Strepsiades as an example in The Clouds, he doesn't take himself so seriously. So he, kind of goofs around and he undermines the city, and then, he cheats, and he's never like fixed on his role. And that gives him an enormous amount of power. And so in The Clouds in particular, you also see the beginning of the erosion of the idea that the gods are really in control because they're being mocked in Strepsiades. And they had been before. This isn't new in Aristophanes necessarily. But at the end of that, you get a kind of cheerful reunification. And Hegel actually says at another point, maybe that's better. Why would we choose the dark and desperate conflict of tragedy over the cheerful, life-affirming, and I think there's a lot of this in Nietzsche too, life-affirming laughter of someone who doesn't have to be so beholden to his roles that he's willing to bring the whole society down around him. Yeah. So there's an extended story that I'm happy to tell if you're interested, about how that changes in modern tragedy and modern comedy. But Hegel is pretty pessimistic about both modern tragedy and modern comedy. And essentially, I think, thinks that we're going to have to transcend both of them, or, and this is another big topic, move to more of a humor-based aesthetic than a comedy-based aesthetic.
Right. I'm going to ask you more about that, about modern comedy and tragedy in a second. But I just wanted to make a brief comment because this was, to some extent, the way people like Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and others in the 19th century approached aesthetics and art somewhat reminds me of how dismissive the post-Socratics were of the pre-Socratics,
Yeah,
because the pre-Socratics took the poets and seriously when it
yeah,
comes to, I mean, perhaps also being able to acquire some sort of knowledge through art, through fiction, and all of that. And I mean, of course, I don't think we can really be sure about what part of it came from Socrates or Plato, because sometimes we don't know for
yeah,
sure if it's Socrates or Plato talking in Plato's works. But anyway, I mean, the Socrates and the other Greek philosophers who came after him were very dismissive of Homer specifically
yeah.
and the other poets. And when you think about the pre-Socratics and even what we call the sophists, I mean, nowadays sophistry has a very negative connotation to it, but the sophists were very much philosophers themselves, I think. I was just, I mean, it just came to my mind that there have been periods in Western philosophy where people have very much been dismissive of art, at least
Yeah.
as a potential source of some kind of knowledge, and others where people really engaged with art seriously and philosophically took art seriously.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think this is the 19th century is one place where that pen direction.
So tell us about the issues that Hegel had with modern forms of art, particularly with what we could call, I guess, modern subjectivity in art. Because as time went on, and particularly since I guess, more or less the 19th century onwards, I mean, in literature and other forms of art, we see people focusing more on particular characters and character development and their subjectivity, even what goes on in their minds through lots and lots of texts, sometimes just focusing on their inner thoughts and all of that. I guess that's what we could call modern subjectivity in art, or perhaps there's also some other forms of subjectivity, but what did Hegel think about it?
I think one of the best places to isolate that is in what he says about humor. And yeah, and I think humor was a really new aesthetic phenomenon. It essentially
Okay.
began with Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, which
Yeah.
was enormously popular in Germany. I mean, Goethe and Schiller and Lessing and anybody who was anybody loved Stern and his evocation of characters who were not comic in the classic sense of like
Okay.
Aristophanes, but were kind of quirky and had foibles and eccentricities that made you kind of gently laugh at them. So not mock them, not
Yeah.
guffaw, but just recognize how much humans get obsessed with what Stern called their hobby horses, like their little things that the little things that they want to be obsessed about. So, whether it's your train set or his uncle's military, uh, what was it? It wasn't exactly a set, like models, I guess. Anyway, so Hegel thought that comedy and humor needed to be differentiated, as did pretty much everybody in his generation. So comedy as the kind of dramatic art form and humor as something that more suffused literature
Yeah.
and poetry, and that highlighted, again, this sense that what is really important to pay attention to among humans now is that since we've discovered, as it were, that we are the source of meaning in the world, what is meaningful to us and how kind of adorably silly that often is, like how adorably silly many of our concerns are. And I think Hegel thought that was really valuable aesthetically because it brought attention to, the concerns of art are no longer the gods or big battles or even like sublime landscapes, but like Dutch genre paintings or still lifes that show tiny little involved human obsessions with flowers or having your tooth pulled or, like everyday human things.
Yeah.
But he did not like it when people became so subjective that they didn't try to extract any larger meaning from whatever it was that they were doing. So he was very critical of Jean-Paul Richter on this point, very critical of people like Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel, and to a lesser extent, people like Novalis, who Hegel thought were way too focused on their own interiority and stream of consciousness, essentially, as you were just describing.
Yeah.
And therefore, again, never made the connection back from subjectivity back into objectivity, and therefore were not giving their audiences an experience of the truth. So that's always what's at stake for Hegel. So he's very critical of what he calls subjective humor and very admiring of what he calls objective humor.
Do you think that Hegel would have been a fan, or at least liked to some extent, the existentialists? Do you think that Hegel would have been a fan, or at least liked to some extent, the existentialists?
I'm not so sure he would have been, to be honest with you. I think he, as I said earlier, he was really interested in making a society function on an institutional level. So what kind of form of government do we need? What kind of social order? What kind of economic order? What kind of family situation? And insofar as existentialists, and this is generalizing, but often emphasized the subject in opposition to those things, I think Hegel would have, again, felt like, well, but what we're after here is truth, which is the unity of unity and division, not just division. And we have a world to run. Like, it's our responsibility to run this world. There's no God out there to help us out. There's no natural order. Like, we've got to get this right. And if there's, and again, this is to caricature, but if existentialists are sometimes seen as self-obsessed or just as oppositional to the order, I think Hegel would have been much more interested in reforming the order in ways that would better allow humans to be free in the way he thought humans needed to be free. And that, back to something we were saying a minute ago, I think this is something that Marx picks up from Hegel, is very much about what kind of material conditions do humans need in order to be free. So it's not enough to say, as Kant did, that you're free if you're self-determining and can act against your inclinations in accordance with the categorical imperative. Yeah. I realize that Kant scholars are going to say that that's not all he meant, and I accept that. But Hegel was much more explicit in trying to say what real freedom means is paying attention to what people need in institutions around them, and just life forms around them in order to flourish as humans with dignity and respect. So again, that's maybe too hard on the existentialists, but I think that might be his general take.
That's very interesting because, of course, we know that Marx was influenced by Hegel to some extent, but sometimes because people have these simplistic views of Hegel and Marx, they think, oh, how could it be? Because Hegel was supposedly a big idealist and Marx was a materialist. I mean, how could they be more opposite? But I mean, what you mentioned there, and Hegel caring very much about how we structure society, about the institutions we create and how we create them based on what values, I guess. I mean, it's very much, I guess, also applied philosophy or political philosophy as some of what Marx also cared about.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that you can find in Hegel that I think is just much more clearly articulated in Marx is that freedom can be a kind of ideological lie if you continue to tell people that they're free as a way of distracting them from the fact that they're being exploited and alienated, right? So if you make people focus on, yes, but I'm a free and determining being because I can follow the categorical imperative, which that's a caricature.
Yeah.
Then people are going to feel like, well, who cares what sort of deprived economic situation I live in? I'm still free. And Hegel, I think, worried that kind of idea could fall into the wrong hands of people who knew how to manipulate it, such that, exactly as you said, you can be a worker who's being totally exploited, but as long as you're told that there's a kind of freedom that exists in transcending that, or not caring about it, or that actually, what it is to be human is to subsist despite the struggle of economic depravity. I think Hegel also would say that's manipulative, it's deceitful, and it's unethical. It is false freedom. It is empty, fake, false freedom, and it can be a kind of a tool in the hands of people who want to manipulate others into ignoring the ways in which they're being exploited.
Which is very interesting, because I guess that this is also another idea that people do not tend at all to associate with Hegel. But as Marx, he also cared about poverty, right? And
Yeah.
about the causes of poverty and the potential effects it would have on people's behavior, correct?
Yeah, so this is specifically in the passages where he talks about what's called the rabble. And I think this is, again, a distinction that Marx picks up on, that what Hegel means by the rabble is not just people who are impoverished. So I think Hegel, like many people, thinks that there will always be poverty. But what's new since, well, not new now, but new since the modern world, essentially,
Yeah.
is the claim that all humans are worthy of dignity and respect, and the acknowledgement, or just the fact, that our economies are human creations. So whereas poverty before could be explained just by natural phenomenon, or just by a hierarchy that we were told was natural, the king gets to be rich and you have to be poor, because God made him the king and made you a pauper. Now, the combination of the claim that all humans are worthy of dignity and respect, and a human-created economy that means that many people live in total depravity, generates a kind of rage on the part of what Hegel then calls the rabble, that is entirely justified, and that Hegel sees as a pretty existential threat to modern society, because they're right, right? It's not that we need them to get over this fact, that they're right about it. And as long as that's true, society will be unstable, because they will correctly demand the material conditions for the thing that they're told is their kind of existential right. So Hegel talks about ways to solve that through essentially what we would call labor unions, or other forms within civil society and within the government, that would represent not just geographical interests, but economic interests. So when you look at what Hegel says about the form the state should take, I think one of the most overlooked facts is that he does not want purely geographical representation. He doesn't want, Prussia gets 2 delegates and Bavaria gets 2 delegates and North Rhine-Westphalia gets 2 delegates, but that different classes and different kinds of industry get representation. So that to me is very clear evidence that he was worried about not just the material conditions of capitalism, but also the questions of identity and self-respect that are necessary in the modern work world, that are essentially trampled on by capitalism.
And so, could we say that Hegel, like Marx, was also, or thought that it was a moral imperative for society to try as best as we could to alleviate or ideally eradicate poverty?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think Hegel thought it could be completely eradicated, but there's no question in my mind that he saw this as the deepest and most insidious kind of hypocrisy, that a society would say on the one hand that everyone is equal and deserving of dignity and respect, and then continue to choose an economic system that made that a joke, right? And it's a very bad joke, a sad joke, that made it laughable in the worst possible way. And that a society that continues down that road is both morally responsible and in danger of instability. So I do think Hegel thinks those two things are separate. So a better functioning society is going to be one with less inequality. But also, that totally aside, just as a moral issue, this is a classic failure.
And just to be totally clear, because at a certain point there you mentioned the fact that some of these ideas stem from the more general idea that individual people themselves have intrinsic value. I mean, this is not just a matter of caring about alleviating poverty with the long-term success of a particular society in mind, but also caring actually about the individuals themselves and the conditions they live in. Right?
Yes, and their emotional and affective attachment to their value as workers. So when he starts to talk about solutions to this kind of poverty, he says, you can certainly get government agencies involved in essentially welfare, but that's not going to fix the problem of self-respect. You have to give people the possibility of having dignity in their work if work is going to be such a central part of existence in a capitalist system. And so, just trying to eradicate it through philanthropy is also not going to fix the problem. It has to come at the level of actually valuing workers in their roles as workers.
Oh my God. So it was not just that Marx was an Hegelian, but Hegel was also a Marxist.
Well, not everybody would agree with me, but yeah, I think that's all very clear to me, that is part of what Hegel was concerned about. And, there are places in his philosophy where he is also guilty of that kind of hypocrisy. So it's not as if he had some sort of moral genius that allowed him to see that in other parts of his life. But I think that was one place where he really did see the dangers that we are living with very presently now.
Yeah, no, but I made that sort of a joke. But if you didn't mention his name, just everything you said about poverty and capitalism and how we should structure society and all of that, if someone told me it was Marx talking, I would believe it.
Yeah, I think that's true. And that would be true until we started talking about the state, right? So Hegel talks about all of this when he's talking about civil society, which is the middle one of the end. So he talks about the family and civil society and the state. And it's when he starts to talk about the state that you would no longer think we were talking about Marx.
Great. So we've already talked here a little bit about comedy, but one of the things you've also done work on, and again, focusing on 19th century German philosophy, is how seriously some of these philosophers took laughter, right?
Yeah, or we might say like the laughable, because it's so hard to put all of the things that we laugh at under, and a lot of things that are laughable we don't actually laugh at. So it's a very thorny topic. But yes, especially around the time when Hegel was writing, again, people like Schlegel and some of the other more romantic philosophers like Solger. We're taking this question of what we laugh at and why, or what it means to differentiate between wit and irony and humor really seriously. And I think that, Lessing was another one who took this very seriously. E.T.A. Hoffman, like the whole constellation of people who were philosophical but also writing in literature. Yeah. And I think, again, it comes back to this question, like, what does it say about humans that we laugh? And what does it say about us that we find this whole range of things either funny or laughable? And what could we determine about the essence of what it is to be human by really trying to figure that out? And if you're someone like Schlegel, who thinks that Hegel is wrong to imagine that we can articulate truth in philosophy, then you're going to be looking towards other forms that maybe, as Schlegel would sort of put it, gesture at the truth while not articulating it, because articulating it is always going to introduce new categories and therefore new division. So if the true is the whole, I think Schlegel would say to Hegel, any conceptualization is just going to show the division again. And if you want something that retains the unity, it has to remain at the level of affect, or something like irony, which doesn't take itself too seriously and doesn't define things, but sort of says that things are true through saying they're opposite, or says something that's witty in a way that you don't take literally, but you see the truth behind it. So all of these are ways in which a whole range of people in the Romantic generation decided that if we could understand that and the way that functions and the way humans interact with each other and lead our aesthetic lives, then we could probably understand something much deeper about humans themselves and about metaphysics, quite honestly. So there's a lot of, I edited a volume of essays about humor in the 19th century. And as I say in the introduction, usually when I tell people that, they laugh because one of the things we laugh at is incongruity. And it feels so incongruous to talk about humor in this generation of very serious philosophers. But it is something they took really seriously.
And I mean, trying to understand something about our human nature through laughter, I mean, there are many different ways we can try to understand it, right? And I mean, even philosophers themselves, many different philosophers across history have had different theories about why people laugh at something. And I mean, perhaps all of them are true, I don't know, because we laugh at different things in different contexts for different reasons. I mean, sometimes we might laugh at something because it's funny, and why it's funny is an entire question by itself. But sometimes perhaps people laugh at someone to mock them, not exactly because it's funny, but just to mock them or to feel superior to other people. Perhaps someone does something wrong and they are, I mean, competing with them, and then the other person laughs just because, oh, you made a mistake, so I'm in a better situation than you are, or something like that. So, I mean, just thinking about laughter itself and the many different contexts and reasons why people laugh is, I mean, it's a very wide field of inquiry, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get now into how you got interested in abolitionism in America in the 19th century. So tell us first about that, what got you interested in that, and then we'll get into the work of Lydia Maria Child.
Yeah, this was a very direct response on my part to the 2016 election in the United States. So when Donald Trump was elected, it became very clear to many of us that we were in a kind of moral and political emergency. So the real resurgence of a kind of far-right political stance and all of the other things that Trump represented, including his just open derision of and abuse of women. Mm-hmm. And I think as a Hegel scholar, I've always had to grapple a little bit with how I felt when I would read Hegel scholarship from the 1930s. And I would always have in the back of my mind, what did this person think they were doing? Was what they were doing more important than anything they could have been doing to fight the rise of fascism in Germany? And I don't mean to be judgmental. I'm sure people have all kinds of reasons, etc. But I just had a very clear sense very quickly that I needed my professional life and my scholarship to reflect the time that I was living in. And I wanted to know who in my own country and in my own history I could turn to as an example of someone who had faced a moral emergency in their country head on. And I just decided I wanted to turn to women. I'd spent 20 years of my career really exclusively focusing on men. And so I asked myself, to fight something as entrenched as enslavement was in the United States in the 19th century, I just thought you'd have to be thinking philosophically. You'd have to be asking big questions like, what is equality? What is justice? What does it mean to be a human? What is moral obligation? So I went to an archive associated with Harvard, and that is a library and an archive specifically about women, and asked if they knew of any women with a kind of philosophical trajectory who had been involved in abolitionism. And they didn't, but they gave me a box of letters that included a letter by this woman who I'd never heard of, but was immediately just transfixed by her moral vision, her ability to argue philosophically, and her ability to dedicate her life to ending entrenched evil in her country. So I decided to pivot towards doing something about her. And at first I did write a couple of more academic articles about her. She was definitely a philosophical thinker. She also talked about philosophy. She read philosophy. She was very influenced by German philosophy. She regularly cites Schiller and Goethe and Herder and John Paul. She mentions Kant. She mentions Hegel. German philosophy was very popular in the United States in the 1830s and 40s when she started writing. So I had a lot of pretty instant connections to her philosophical thinking. But what really, again, got my attention was she wrote a book in 1833, and that's almost 3 decades before the American Civil War started. So in 1833, wrote a book called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans. Yeah. And this is just a fire hose of arguments denouncing all of the bad arguments that Americans had been using to justify slavery. And I was so impressed by how I think her general philosophical commitment was to thinking that humans are basically good, but they're susceptible to bad arguments that appeal to their selfishness, their self-interest, their vanity. And if you can just clear away those arguments, you can really get them to reform. I'm not sure she was right about that. I don't even think she thought she was right about that by the end of her life. But I became really fascinated both by her as a philosophical thinker, but also as a woman whose life intersects in all of the major moments leading up to and through the American Civil War. She did everything from put her body between abolitionist speakers and anti-abolitionist mobs. She wrote fiction and also argumentative essays. She wrote biographies. She wrote histories. She volunteered herself raising money for and sewing for both Union soldiers and enslaved peoples. So she is to me a real example of someone who took her role as an American citizen seriously and deployed everything she could think of to address what she saw as the great moral crisis in her country. So I wrote a biography of her. Again, I thought I would just sort of write academic articles about her, but the story is so compelling that I ended up just writing the whole thing, and that came out about 6 months ago.
Great. And I mean, we also have to keep in mind that the 19th century was not, to put it mildly, very women-friendly, and also, for the most part, not very friendly to any person who was not of European descent, basically in terms of the mainstream philosophers, thinkers, scientists, and so on. I mean, of course, we have to keep also in mind the cultural context back then, and I'm also not one of those people who, of course, I say that they were wrong in terms of their sexism and racism, but I don't think that if I lived back then, I wouldn't have been a racist and sexist myself. Of course, very likely I would have been one as well, and
Yeah.
most of us, I guess. So, but I mean, we have to keep that in mind, but also the struggle that women and African Americans and other minorities went through, and particularly since we are approaching things here from a philosophical perspective, and I'm talking with you as an academic. I mean, it's historically it's a fact, and even contemporarily, that uh, women and other minorities, I mean, their work has very much been neglected, sometimes suppressed, and stuff like that, right? So it's not been easy at all for people who are not European white males, and European white males, particularly from the upper
Right.
classes, to have their voices heard, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's really wonderful work being done on that. So Kristen Yesdal and Dalia Nassar just last year published a whole anthology of work by women philosophers in Germany in the 19th century. And Alison Stone and I are working on a handbook about British and American women philosophers in the 19th century. There were many more of them than we think there were,
Yeah,
and they were often much better known than we think they were. So what we're talking about is a combination of course, women didn't have the same opportunities as men as far as education goes, but even those who managed to philosophize despite that were pretty actively repressed and forgotten later, like not in their lifetimes, but later. So there's a lot of really interesting work on that. That I feel very passionate about. And I also think, to your other point, it's really important for us to acknowledge in as much detail as we can the damage that people like Hegel did on these topics. So I think even myself as a woman, I used to just sort of think, well, of course he thought women were like plants, like everybody did. But that's not true. There were lots of people, including women, who didn't think that. But he did have options available to him, and even more so on race. So there's really important work by Daniel James and Franz Kopik and others on what Hegel probably did know about other ways of thinking about non-European peoples, which he deliberately chose to ignore or suppress. And there's even terrible stories about Hegel's like philosophy of history being used as a justification in the United States for perpetuating slavery. And I was talking earlier about Hegel's ability to pinpoint hypocrisies in a culture that said, on the one hand, all humans are worthy of dignity and respect, and on the other hand, subjecting them to capitalism's woes. Obviously, Hegel himself is horrendously guilty of doing that pretty much with anyone who wasn't, as you said, an upper class white European male.
yeah,
And I have become much less willing just to say, well, okay, that's like a part of his philosophy we can ignore, and much more determined to take that head on. And as you say, too, importantly, augmented with a kind of humility that reminds myself as well that I'm probably on the wrong side of history on other things, and that if I were living at Hegel's time, I probably would have had many opinions that were not very enlightened either. So to
yeah,
me, that's part of the general project of thinking about the 19th century, is elevating voices like Child's that are so philosophical and so resonant, and using the same kinds of ideas, including ideas about art, that Hegel was interested in, but really in the service of good. and trying to be much more mindful and critical of ways in which Hegel's philosophy, as beautiful and compelling as it can be, was used for evil.
Yeah. I mean, this is another entire discussion that I think is very interesting and people can have. I mean, and the same applies to artists. I mean, sometimes people discuss if what we should do with the work of immoral artists, if we should ban it, if not, if we don't ban it, how we should analyze it, how we should think of it, if we should appreciate it or not, and if we should criticize it. I mean, there's an immensity of questions out there that are very interesting about that. But I mean, of course, I'm not myself, and I don't think you are some of those people that think that perhaps we should, because someone in the 19th century or the 18th century had some appalling views on women and black people and other minorities, that we should just completely ignore or think that the rest of their work doesn't have any intellectual validity at all. But yeah, it's very much a well established fact that all of the people we talked about in German philosophy in the 19th century, and Kant was mostly from the 18th century, and others like them. I mean, it's interesting that even Kant was talking about universal values, but apparently they didn't apply to non-European people.
Yeah.
Curiously enough, but I mean, the same thing, I guess, happened in other sorts of instances. Like, for example, you had the French Revolution, and supposedly everyone should get a vote, everyone should get a saying, but it was just very gradually that the population in France, the adult population, got to a right to vote. I mean, first it was just one slice of the male population, and then and the same happened in America. I think that initially it was just the people who owned land, I guess, who had the right to vote, and then it was
All of that was in flux for a very long time here.
yeah.
That's true. And the other thing to bring up, I think, in the context of the French Revolution is the Haitian Revolution, and the fact that France absolutely did not want any of their revolutionary principles to apply to a part of the world that was primarily inhabited by Black people. So that's another classic case of the kind of hypocrisy that I think you're right. To me, it just feels increasingly important to acknowledge those problems always and upfront and in every part of our discussion of these earlier thinkers, and never to treat it as something we can just sort of mention on the side and then move on from. But I don't think that ignoring these people is good either, because it's important for us to remember that even people who were intelligent and progressive in other ways could make really horrendous mistakes.
And I guess that it's not only important from a sort of ethical standpoint, but also intellectually speaking. I guess it's enriching to have a better understanding of how our socio-cultural context can influence and have an impact on our intellectual work, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need to understand why we think what we think. And understanding thinkers that came before us is an indispensable part of that, for sure.
And also keeping in mind that, again, people are not disembodied beings, and we live, and we not only have a body, but we also live in a particular society, in a particular period of time, in a particular culture. We have a ton of different influences, and we are also products of all of that. Even intellectually, it's not that we have some sort of reasoning faculty that is impermeable to all of that, and that allow us to get some sort of glimpse into objective reality as it is, right?
Yeah, and I'll also just say briefly, that's one of the things that really fascinates me about Child is that she was able in many ways to transcend and to see beyond what was absolutely the norm around her. And I'm
Yep.
really fascinated by that. And most of your viewers will know that. So she grew up in Boston, which is in the North,
Yeah.
and most Northerners now assume that all Northerners then were against slavery. And that's absolutely not true. Absolutely not true. Many Northerners actively resisted the end of slavery in the South. So she was surrounded by politicians and educators and journalists and religious leaders who actively preached that this was an acceptable way for society to be organized. And somehow she saw beyond it. And she wasn't alone in that. And I'll also say, part of how she knew this is she actually talked to Black people, right? So she actually listened to the people who were themselves affected, and once was able to see it from their point of view, realized that what she was hearing from the leaders in her society was wrong. So again, I don't mean to suggest that she had some sort of, as you say, disembodied experience, but she was willing to listen in a way that I take as an inspiration to those of us who sometimes, it's a kind of occupational hazard for philosophers. We like to look at things from very high up. And often I think it takes more of a listening on the ground to get real ethical insight into what needs to happen next.
By the way, at least back in her time, how influential was her? I mean, in the philosophical world and more specifically in the abolitionist movement in the US.
She was very influential. She was one of the most famous abolitionists of the 19th century. And part of what's so interesting about her is that she was famous before she became an abolitionist, because she, almost unheard of in the American 19th century, by the age of 22, which would have been, in the mid 1820s, was a very well-known novelist and a self-sufficient female author. And she'd written a couple novels and a couple of self-help books, like cooking books or books about parenting or housekeeping, that had made her really beloved and trusted among a great swath. I mean, she was the 19th century equivalent of a household name. And when she became an abolitionist, that was so upsetting to her readers, because it really meant that she was a radical. Because to be an abolitionist in the 1820s and 30s in the United States was to argue for the immediate end of slavery without compensation to enslavers. And most Americans in the North and the South thought that that was just unthinkably radical. But that's what she was convinced in, by the time she was about 30. And she continued to be one of the best published and most public-facing intellectuals of the 19th century, and certainly in the abolitionist movement. As far as her involvement in the philosophical community, it's interesting. I mean, there wasn't so much a philosophical tradition in the United States, except really for the one that was getting going again in Boston around Ralph Waldo Emerson. And they did know each other. They were almost exact contemporaries. And she was admiring and would go to his lectures, but also was always concerned that he was allowing the abstraction of his thought to distract him from what she thought he should be doing, which was fighting slavery. So she'd sometimes say he has a platform big enough and a mind capacious enough really to make arguments against slavery, and he's not doing it. Emerson did come around to doing that, but only in 1859, when John Brown's failed insurrection in Virginia convinced him that slavery needed to be opposed. So she certainly knew all of the philosophers in the Boston area of her time and socialized with them, communicated with them. But I think she feared that they had disengaged themselves from the moral topics of their day too much.
Okay, so I'm also getting mindful of your time now. So let me ask you one last question, and let me see if I can phrase this correctly, so and be clear about it. I mean, there are some parts of philosophy that are politically motivated. Like, for example, abolitionism is a very clear example of that. And there are people that tend to be a little bit dismissive of philosophy that is done while politically motivated, and usually those people come from political positions that are opposite to the ones that they say are not valid philosophy, of course. So the question I wanted to ask you then is, how do you look at the place of a movement like abolitionism in the broader historical context of philosophy? And I mean, when it comes to how people look again at politically motivated philosophy, I mean, to what extent do you think we should take it seriously? And I mean, what do you think basically about those people's positions that, oh, I mean, philosophy should be about, I don't know, people in academia. I mean, it's transmitting knowledge to students shouldn't be about turning them into activists or something like that. So, I mean, I hope I'm being clear in terms
Yeah.
of the question I'm asking here, but what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, thank you. It's such an important question to me now, so I appreciate the chance to think about it. I guess a couple of things. First of all, philosophy has not always been removed from reality. And I think like the story of the 19th century into the 20th century is much more about philosophy deciding to extract itself from practice. And there are historical reasons for that. But I think we're wrong if we assume, and this isn't what you were saying either, but I think some of the people you're thinking about would say this, that real philosophy shouldn't dirty its hands or shouldn't kind of get involved in the world because then it's not as pure. That's a choice that philosophy has made relatively recently as a discipline. And it has to do with the professionalization of philosophy. In the 19th century in the United States, well, the three cases I know most about are the US, the UK, and Germany. You couldn't get a degree in philosophy no matter who you were for a long time, right? PhDs weren't invented that long ago. And even after they were invented, they weren't necessary to philosophizing. Philosophical journals did not used to require that you came from, that you had a PhD in philosophy to publish. So the professionalization of philosophy has meant that what it means to do philosophy has gotten narrower and narrower and narrower, more elitist, more professionalized. But there's a very long history of philosophy being born out of grappling with the real world, as it were. And I don't think there's been a social movement in history that hasn't required people to think philosophically. I mean, Angela Davis is a great example of someone who was doing a PhD in philosophy before she became an activist and brought her studies in Spinoza and Kant and Hegel to her struggle for racial justice in the United States. But I think pretty much anywhere you look, you would find people who are fighting for justice thinking philosophically. And I've been very happy to see people emphasizing that more. So people are writing about Martin Luther King as a philosopher, for instance.
I was going to say that perhaps another excellent example would be the civil rights movements in the 1960s and 70s.
Yeah, exactly. So I think a more, or an alternate model, and I think in some ways a truer model to philosophy's history, is that when people are confronted with injustices, they have to ask those bigger questions. And I think what philosophy can do to empower us is to give us some clarity about those questions. So, really, what is justice? We can go back to the Republic to find people trying to figure that out. And so when I teach philosophy, I don't at all think of myself as trying to turn my students into activists, but I do think that I want them to see that philosophy can be a really powerful and even essential tool for understanding the terms of our debates and the kinds of things we want to fight for, and then giving us the clarity of thought that can motivate action. So when I think about the way movements work, sometimes what happens is people just aren't particularly clear what they're fighting for and why. And what that means is that whenever there's infighting or tension or unclear, like you can just lose focus and get, distracted by the details. But the better you are at saying, no, I thought this through philosophically, even if you don't phrase it that way, this is what is important. This is what, back to Hegel, really creating a society in which people can truly be free and not just abstractly free. This is what it would look like. That is empowering and motivating in a way that can help us stave off the kind of burnout or fatalism that is all too often the death of movements for justice. So I would prefer to think philosophy as something that is sort of born out of humans just trying to figure our way out in the world. And the more those of us who are inclined to think philosophically can articulate those thoughts and help people think them through, I think the better chance philosophy has of actually fulfilling a good purpose in the world.
Yeah, and perhaps, people who might be worried about keeping some of the philosophical traditions of the West, perhaps they should also keep in mind that if Plato is the father of Western philosophy, then he wrote a book titled The Republic, which it would be very hard to argue that it's not politically motivated, because it's literally a book about how to structure politically a society from top to bottom. So
Yep.
there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more I think we recognize that philosophy has been done in many different ways. So like the academic article, really new. I mean, we think about like Plato writing in dialogues and Aristotle giving lectures and, Kant writing something more that we recognize as philosophy, but people writing philosophically through literature, Nietzsche through aphorisms,
Yeah.
like many of our most important philosophers have been really disruptive of what people thought philosophy was. And so I do not feel like my time is well spent fighting for a version of philosophy that I think is pretty historically contingent, sometimes harmful, and not where the real energy of philosophy should be.
Great. So let's wrap up the interview here then. Just before we go, and by the way, I'm also leaving a link in the description box to your book, Lydia Maria Child. And apart from the book, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, thank you. I do have a website, which is just lydiamoland.com, and I am also on Twitter. I think that's Lydia_Moland. And I have maybe 2 things on Instagram. So I've never been a big social media person. I'm dipping my toes in a little bit, but Twitter is where I post the most, and I do try to keep the website updated. So people are more interested in any of my writing. All of my writing is listed on the website, and what I'm working on now is findable on Twitter.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Moland, thank you very much for your time, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Likewise, thanks for your very insightful and detailed questions. I really enjoyed it.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please do not forget to like it, share, comment, and subscribe. And if you like more generally what I'm doing, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. You have all of the links in the description of this interview. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Muller, Hans Fredrik Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alec, Jonathan Visser, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henrik Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Simon Columbus, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreeff, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Meira, Tom Hummel, Sardis France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correa, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Howman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yagi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Panos Cortez, Ursula Litska, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Morten Eklund, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Olsen, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Amaury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Holt Ericbun, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Tom Roth, DRPMD, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Richard Bowen, Thomas Dobner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Manuel Oliveira, Kimberly Johnson, and Benjamin Gelbart. A special thanks to my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Hugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Robert Lewis, and Al Nick Ortiz, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadrian, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.